to, there was possibly going to be a scene where we had to dance. It was a World War II movie, Swing Shift. And so we thought it'd be a good idea perhaps to...
At 74 years old, Kurt Russell has finally broken his silence about the king of rock and roll. And what he has revealed left fans stunned. For decades, Russell's name has been tied to Elvis Presley's. Not just because of his uncanny portrayal of the icon in the 1979 biopic, but because of a bond that stretched back to his childhood. While most of Hollywood only ever saw Elvis as a superstar, Kurt saw something different. He saw a man trapped between two worlds, adored by millions, but haunted when the spotlight dimmed. For years, Russell kept those private memories close to his chest. He refused to exploit them, even as Elvis's story was told and retold by countless others. But now, at an age when reflection comes naturally, Russell is ready to share the truth about Elvis the legend, Elvis the man, and Elvis as no one else has ever described him. What he reveals is both heartbreaking and unforgettable, a story only he could tell. In 1963, a young Kurt Russell was just another child actor in Hollywood, working to make a name for himself, when fate placed him face to face with Elvis Presley. The movie was It Happened at the World's Fair, a light-hearted film that featured Elvis at the height of his popularity. Russell's role was small but unforgettable. He was the boy who was paid to run up and kick Elvis in the shin. It was just a short, comedic moment on screen, but it marked the beginning of a connection that would follow Kurt for the rest of his life. What the cameras didn't capture, however, was how Elvis treated the young boy once the scene was done. Elvis wasn't distant or dismissive, as some stars might be to child actors. Instead, he showed kindness, playfulness, and genuine warmth. Russell has said in recent years that he remembered how Elvis would smile at him, talk to him like a friend, and make sure he wasn't intimidated on set. For a boy who was only 12 years old, that meant everything. It gave Russell his first real glimpse at what fame could look like, not as a dream, but as a reality. He saw firsthand how Elvis carried himself, how people around him were drawn to his presence, and also how quickly the mood shifted when the cameras stopped rolling. Elvis, even then, seemed to carry a certain loneliness in his eyes, as though the weight of being Elvis Presley was heavier than anyone else could understand. That brief interaction made a lasting impression on Kurt, one he couldn't shake as he grew older. While to the public, it was just a funny scene in a film, to Kurt Russell, it was a defining childhood memory, one that would resurface years later when destiny called again. Decades afterward, when Kurt was asked to portray Elvis in a television biopic, he realized that he was one of the very few actors alive who had actually shared screen time with the king himself. And not only that, but he had felt Elvis's presence up close, had seen both the charm and the vulnerability that most people only guessed at. That one kick to the shin became symbolic. It was playful, innocent, and fleeting, but it tied Russell to Elvis forever. And while Kurt didn't know it then, that small act would one day grow into the role of a lifetime and a responsibility he would carry for decades. By the late 1970s, Kurt Russell had grown into a young man steadily building his career, but nothing could have prepared him for the role that would forever shape the way the world saw him. Just 2 years after Elvis Presley's shocking death in 1977, television producers wanted to bring Elvis's story to life in a way that was raw, human, and truthful. It wouldn't be easy. Millions of fans were still mourning, and the image of Elvis was divided between the glamorous icon of the 1950s and the tragic figure of his final years. When casting began for the 1979 television biopic simply titled Elvis, there was only one actor who had both the charm, the physicality, and the ability to capture the king's essence: Kurt Russell. From the very beginning, the stakes were enormous. This wasn't just another role. It was a cultural event. Elvis's family was watching. Fans were watching. The world was watching. For Russell, the weight was almost unbearable. He knew that if he failed, it wouldn't just be his career that suffered. He would dishonor the memory of the most beloved entertainer in American history. Russell threw himself into preparation with an intensity that stunned even those close to him. He studied Elvis's movements endlessly, learning the way he walked, the subtle tilt of his head, the way his hands moved while holding a microphone. He worked tirelessly to perfect the Southern drawl, making sure that every word carried the cadence of Elvis's voice. But beyond the mannerisms, Russel knew he had to capture something deeper, the humanity of Elvis Presley. He wasn't interested in playing a caricature. He wanted to play the man. Friends later said that Russel became almost possessed by the role. He would watch old footage of Elvis for hours, not just memorizing the moves, but staring into his eyes, trying to understand what he was feeling in those moments. Russel's dedication paid off in ways no one expected. When the film aired in 1979, audiences were stunned. Many fans said it was the first time they truly saw Elvis as a person, and not just as a myth. Critics praised Russel's performance, calling it haunting, powerful, and uncanny. Some even went so far as to say it felt as though Elvis had been brought back to life, if only for a few hours. To this day, many insiders argue that no one, not even later portrayals by bigger Hollywood stars, has come close to matching what Russel achieved. The role catapulted him into the spotlight, cementing him as a serious actor, but it also did something more profound. It connected him to Elvis in a way that transcended Hollywood. Russel wasn't just another actor playing a part. He was the vessel through which millions of fans grieved, remembered, and celebrated the king. That connection would follow him for the rest of his career, shaping how audiences saw him and how he saw himself. It was the role of a lifetime, but it also became a shadow, one that reminded Russel every day of the responsibility he carried to honor a man whose life was both magnificent and tragic. What most people never knew about the making of the 1979 Elvis film was how deeply personal it became for Kurt Russell long before the cameras started rolling. The project carried a kind of sacred weight, because Elvis Presley wasn't just another celebrity whose life could be dramatized for television ratings. He was still a fresh wound for millions of fans around the world. Elvis had died only 2 years earlier, and grief was still raw. The producers knew that in order for the film to be authentic, they needed the blessing of the Presley family. That blessing came from none other than Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, and his approval was not given lightly. When Vernon Presley looked at Kurt Russell, he didn't just see a talented actor. He saw someone who had actually known his son, even if only briefly, all the way back in 1963. That personal connection mattered. Vernon trusted that Russell would not turn Elvis into a parody, or reduce him to a collection of flashy stage moves and exaggerated quirks. Instead, he believed Kurt could capture the essence of Elvis, the son he knew behind the fame. That responsibility weighed heavily on Russell. He wasn't just acting for a paycheck or a career boost. He was carrying the hopes of a grieving father and the legacy of a man whose image meant everything to an entire generation. The shoot itself was grueling, days were long, and the emotional intensity was unlike anything Russell had experienced. There were moments on set when the weight of the role became almost eerie. Russell later admitted that he felt as though Elvis's presence hovered around him, watching, guiding, and sometimes haunting his performance. Crew members even remarked that the transformation was uncanny. When Russell slipped into costume and began speaking in Elvis's voice, it was as though the king himself had returned. But this haunting realism came with a cost. Russell would go home exhausted, drained not just physically, but emotionally. He wasn't just playing a role, he was stepping into a life that ended in tragedy. And the more he immersed himself, the more he felt the shadows of Elvis's struggles pressing in on him. The vulnerability, the loneliness, the sense of being trapped between glory and despair, all of it became real to Russell in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet, despite the heaviness, there were also moments of light. Russell spoke about how he wanted to portray the joy Elvis brought to the world, the electricity of his performances, and the charisma that made him larger than life. He didn't want the film to be just a sad story. He wanted it to be a celebration too. Balancing that duality was the hardest challenge of his career, but it was also the most rewarding. When Vernon Presley finally watched Russell's portrayal, he was moved to tears. He told those close to him that it was the first time he felt as though the world could finally see Elvis not just as a superstar, but as the human being he had raised. For Kurt Russell, that was the ultimate validation. While the public only saw Kurt Russell's uncanny portrayal of Elvis on screen, what they didn't know was how many private stories and confessions were entrusted to him during the making of the film. In preparing for the role, Russell spoke to the people who had lived closest to Elvis, those who had been inside Graceland when the doors were closed to the world. He listened to musicians who had shared the stage with the king, bodyguards who had seen him at his most vulnerable, and friends who watched as fame consumed him from the inside out. What Russell heard stayed with him for decades, and only now, at 74, has he begun to reveal just how shocking and heartbreaking those memories were. These weren't the glamorous tales of sold-out concerts and screaming fans. They were stories of a man who, despite having everything, often felt as though he had nothing. Russell learned that Elvis, for all his charisma, longed desperately for normalcy. He wanted to walk down a street without being mobbed. He wanted to sit in a diner without cameras flashing in his face. He wanted to be a father, a husband, and a friend, without those roles being overshadowed by his title as the King. In quiet conversations, Russell was told about Elvis's late-night struggles, pacing through Graceland with an energy he couldn't burn off, his mind restless, his body worn down. There were whispers of his battles with prescription drugs, of how they were introduced not out of recklessness, but out of exhaustion and pressure. Russell was stunned to hear how often Elvis was forced to perform even when he was sick, because the machine of fame demanded it. He was a man pulled in every direction, by the fans who adored him, by the managers who relied on him, by the family who loved him, and by the industry that refused to let him rest. Russell also heard stories that humanized Elvis in ways the public rarely imagined. Friends told him how Elvis would play with his daughter Lisa Marie for hours, crawling on the floor, laughing like any ordinary father. Musicians spoke of the generosity Elvis showed, buying cars and houses for people he cared about, sometimes for strangers he barely knew, simply because he wanted to see someone smile. Russell realized that behind the glitter and headlines was a man whose greatest gift was not just his music, but his heart. Yet even with that generosity, Elvis was often alone. Russell has since admitted that these stories left him conflicted, torn between admiration for Elvis's kindness and sorrow for the emptiness he carried. When Kurt stepped into Elvis's shoes on screen, it wasn't just about perfecting a voice or a stance. It was about carrying these untold memories with him, letting them guide the way he portrayed the king. And while audiences saw only the final performance, Russell knew he was giving them more than a character. He was giving them fragments of truth that Elvis himself never got to say out loud. When the Elvis biopic finally aired in 1979, viewers were captivated, critics were stunned, and Kurt Russell was catapulted into a new level of stardom. Yet what the public never knew was just how much the film meant behind the scenes, and how Hollywood quietly protected the deeper story of Russell's transformation. Industry insiders understood that Russell had done more than simply act. He had carried the weight of Elvis's image at a time when the world was still grieving, and he had done it with such devotion that it almost blurred the line between actor and subject. To this day, some cast and crew members whisper that Russell didn't just play Elvis, he channeled him. The performance was so precise, so emotionally charged, that many people on set felt as if they were watching Elvis himself come back to life. That eerie realism was both a gift and a curse. It gave the world a chance to celebrate Elvis again, but it also tied Russell's identity to the king in a way that Hollywood insiders rarely speak about openly. There was a quiet understanding among producers, agents, and even fellow actors that Russell had given a piece of himself to the role, something he couldn't simply take back when the cameras stopped. It became Hollywood's best-kept secret that behind the accolades and applause, Kurt Russell had been changed forever. Unlike many actors who capitalized on such iconic roles, Russell stayed silent. He rarely spoke publicly about the extent of his preparation, the stories he was told by Elvis's closest confidants, or the emotional toll the role took on him. While others wrote books, gave interviews, and cashed in on Elvis's legacy, Russell stepped back. His silence was not indifference. It was respect. He believed Elvis's story was not his to exploit, and so he kept those memories locked away. Over the decades, as Hollywood revisited Elvis with new films and documentaries, Russell's performance remained the benchmark, the gold standard. Even as newer portrayals emerged, critics and fans alike continued to say that Kurt Russell had done it best, not just because of his acting ability, but because he had captured something more elusive, Elvis's soul. And yet, Russell himself rarely basked in that praise. To him, the role was sacred. The silence, the restraint, and the refusal to expose Elvis's private struggles for personal gain only deepened the mystery around Russell's connection to the king. It wasn't until he reached his 70s that he finally began to peel back the curtain, admitting just how heavy that responsibility had been, and how deeply Elvis had marked him. For decades, Hollywood kept this truth in the shadows. They let the myth of Kurt Russell's perfect Elvis performance stand on its own, while quietly acknowledging that the actor himself had lived with the ghost of Presley long after the cameras stopped rolling. It was a story too powerful, too personal, and perhaps too painful to be told back then. But now, with time on his side and the weight of silence lifted, Russell is finally speaking. And the truth is more profound than anyone imagined. Even as Kurt Russell's career took off in the years after Elvis, the shadow of the king never truly left him. While Russell went on to star in cult classics like Escape from New York, thrillers like The Thing, and blockbusters like Tombstone and Backdraft, fans and interviewers alike continued to bring him back to 1979. The questions always circled back to Elvis. How did he prepare? What was Elvis really like? Did playing the king change him? For Russell, the answers were never simple, because Elvis wasn't just a role he left behind on a soundstage. It was a presence that had followed him into his personal life, his family life, and even the way he viewed fame itself. Russell admitted later that embodying Elvis left him with a strange kind of awareness about the price of stardom. He had seen what fame could do, not just by studying Elvis's life, but by feeling it in his own body when he slipped into that role. He experienced the rush of being adored, even if only in imitation, but he also felt the crushing weight of expectations, the loneliness of living under a microscope, and the loss of normalcy that comes when the world believes you are larger than life. This awareness shaped the choices he made throughout his career. Unlike many actors of his generation, Russell avoided the trappings of tabloid culture. He and Goldie Hawn, his longtime partner, became famous not just for their enduring relationship, but for the way they guarded their private lives. They raised their family largely away from the glare of cameras, refusing to let Hollywood dictate how they lived. In many ways, Russell has admitted, this was a direct lesson from Elvis. He had seen how isolation, constant scrutiny, and the inability to live an ordinary life ate away at the king's spirit. He didn't want to repeat that mistake. And so, while Russell became a Hollywood star in his own right, he consciously separated his work from his private world. Yet the Elvis connection lingered everywhere. Fans still approached him to talk about the biopic, calling his performance the most authentic they had ever seen. Directors and casting agents often referenced the role not just as an achievement, but as a defining moment that proved Russell could carry a film with depth and charisma. Even in films unrelated to Elvis, subtle nods would appear, like his cameo in Forrest Gump, where his voice dubbed over a young actor playing Elvis. It was as though Hollywood itself refused to separate the two men. Russell never ran from it, but he never fully embraced it either. He carried it quietly, respectfully, allowing Elvis's shadow to exist without letting it consume him. Still, as he has now admitted in later years, the king's story remained a constant reminder in his mind, a reminder of the fragility of fame, the danger of excess, and the loneliness that often comes with greatness. Elvis's life was both a warning and a lesson, and Kurt Russell, unlike most, had lived close enough to that flame to never forget its heat. At 74, Kurt Russell has finally opened up about the truth he has carried silently for decades. And it is not the polished, glamorous story fans might expect. His words are raw, emotional, and filled with a respect that can only come from someone who lived close enough to the fire to feel its heat, but far enough to see the shadows it cast. Russell describes Elvis Presley as both the happiest and the loneliest man he had ever encountered, a paradox that defined the king's entire existence. On stage, Elvis was larger than life. He could electrify an arena with a single hip shake, a single note, a single smile. The roar of the crowd was like thunder, and yet, as Russell now reveals, that thunder only echoed louder against the silence Elvis felt when the stage went dark. Behind closed doors, he was a man yearning for something simpler, something real, friendship without conditions, love without expectations, and peace without cameras. Russell admits that when he studied Elvis, not just the public image, but the personal recollections of those who loved him, he realized that the king had an uncanny awareness of his own fate. Elvis seemed to know, in an almost haunting way, that his life would not stretch into old age. He spoke often, Russell says, of legacy, of music that would outlive him, of wanting to be remembered not just for his mistakes, but for the joy he gave. And in those conversations, Russell believes, lay the clearest sign that Elvis carried the burden of prophecy on his shoulders. He was destined to be both immortal and gone too soon. What struck Russell most was not the tales of drugs or exhaustion, though those were ever present, but the deep sadness reflected in Elvis's eyes. He recalls people describing how Elvis could sit in a crowded room filled with laughter, yet appear utterly alone, disconnected from everyone, even those closest to him. This was the Elvis Russell carried with him while making the biopic, and this is the Elvis he finally speaks about today. Not the caricature of jumpsuits and Vegas stages, but the man inside the myth, the human being who could be tender, funny, generous, but also weighed down by crushing isolation. Russell confesses that portraying Elvis left him haunted for years because he couldn't shake the feeling that he had, in some ways, lived Elvis's final days with him. He remembers studying old footage, replaying interviews, staring into Elvis's gaze until it felt like he was looking directly into the soul of a man, silently crying out for help. When the cameras rolled on the film, Russell wasn't just acting, he was reliving those moments, channeling the pain, the joy, and the inevitable fall. Now, with the wisdom of age, Russell has finally admitted that he believes Elvis should not be remembered for the way he died or the scandals that surrounded him, but for the way he lived, the music, the generosity, the heart that gave endlessly until it had nothing left to give. He insists that Elvis was not just the king of rock and roll. He was a man who gave more of himself to the world than most ever will, and that is how he deserves to be remembered. For Russell, speaking this truth is more than confession. It is closure. After decades of silence, he no longer feels bound by the need to protect Elvis's memory through omission. Instead, he honors it by sharing the reality as he saw it. Elvis was a man who carried a crown too heavy for anyone to bear, but wore it anyway, because the world demanded it. And in doing so, he gave everything he had until there was nothing left. As Kurt Russell reflects at 74, the story he finally tells about Elvis Presley is not just about the king's rise and fall, but about how two lives, separated by age and destiny, became forever intertwined. For Russell, Elvis was never just a role or a childhood memory. He was a constant presence, a shadow that lingered over his career, and a teacher whose lessons outlived him. When Kurt looks back now, he realizes that his path in Hollywood, his careful balance of fame and privacy, his refusal to let the industry consume his family life, his insistence on doing things his own way, was shaped in no small part by the ghost of Elvis Presley. He saw what unchecked adoration, endless pressure, and loss of freedom could do to a man. He saw that greatness often comes at the cost of peace, and he swore silently to himself that he would not let that same fate claim him. That vow, though never spoken aloud, became Russel's quiet tribute to the king. He carried Elvis's memory not by mimicking him endlessly or by retelling his story at every opportunity, but by living differently, by proving that one could be both famous and free, both respected and unbroken. This, perhaps, is why Russel's career has endured. Unlike so many of his peers, he was not devoured by the Hollywood machine. He built a legacy on his terms, much like Elvis tried to, but with the wisdom of knowing where the traps were laid. In recent years, when asked why he remained so protective of Elvis's memory for so long, Russel answered simply, "Because he gave the world so much. I couldn't take more from him." That statement alone reveals the depth of the bond. It wasn't about profit. It wasn't about fame. It was about respect. And now, in Finally Speaking, Russel has chosen to give Elvis something back. The truth as he saw it, unfiltered and unvarnished. He wants the world to remember not the bloated tabloid image of a fallen star, but the young man who lit up the screen, who sang with fire, who gave strangers cars just to see them smile, and who longed quietly for the peace he was denied. Russel insists that Elvis's story is not a tragedy, but a lesson, a reminder that even the brightest stars are human, that even kings carry burdens unseen by the crowd. And in telling that story, Kurt has also revealed something about himself, that his greatest role was not Snake Plissken, Wyatt Earp, or even Elvis Presley. It was the role of guardian, the man who protected the humanity of a legend until the world was ready to hear it. Today, both men stand as icons in their own right, Elvis as the eternal king of rock and roll, and Kurt Russell as the actor who carried his spirit with dignity. Their legacies are now forever linked, not just through a film, but through a bond that stretched across decades. One man gave his life to music and burned out too soon. The other gave his life to storytelling and endured long enough to tell the tale. Together, they remind us that legends never truly die. They live on in the songs, in the films, in the memories, and in the truths finally spoken when the silence ends.